Okay, so gonna try this. This is only about my fourth time trying to start this lecture, trying to use my tablet, and that's been a bit of a disaster, but hopefully this will go a bit smoother. Lecture number two, talking about schools in the context of everything that we've got going on with all of these new standards and guidelines and programs and curriculum. So it does get there's a whole new sort of layers of what we're looking at. But I think before we do that, I think the one thing to keep in mind is that one of the things that starts to make this aspect of what we're talking about a bit more complicated is because we do have students, and these guys right here create another layer. So there's a whole layer of guidelines and rules that are around students taking ownership, students being self-directed. It's one of the greatest things about the internet is that students become teachers, and sometimes they teach themselves better than their teachers, which I'm sure you guys can sympathize with or empathize. There's also administration within the schools, teachers, curriculum, community members. So all those different layers really start to make this scenario much more complicated. So I think one of the things that we want to go over that hopefully you've been noticing as we look at our information around through the national standards, that really what we're seeing is a convergence. That public spaces and healthy communities is this convening of different things. And for us as landscape architects, stewardship and education are starting to come together. So we're really starting to see these two things. Where is that line? Where is the line between these two things? Does that exist? Do we as designers really incorporate that in and really start to think about any aspect of what we design and what we build? How does stewardship and education fall into that aspect of it? Health, well, not health. First, community, efficacy, and culture. One of the things really that we'll be looking at is the seamlessness around how these kinds of things become incorporated into design at multiple scales and the value of that. Ecology and the landscape. And then lastly, which we see with well-building now being pulled into LEED, I think one of the things that's sort of ironic about this is that when you get done and you just look at this whole thing, we have standards now that are starting to just deal with everything. What's not in there, which is good, but a bit ironic, I think. So what that really we think about then is that you really can't affect the health of people until you move outside the walls of your institution or even of healthcare yourself. This was a great quote that came from a healthcare forum, and I apologize you can't see the bottom of that because I didn't make my screen big enough. But the action is to reframe your mission from curing disease to creating health, and then one step further to build a healthy community. So really, one of the reasons as landscape architects in this class that we are going in and we are diving into LEED, and we're looking at the building and we're looking at the community and we're looking at the site, is that you really can't solve so many of the things that we are trying to do unless we look at all aspects of that. So schools then are this template for sustainability, because the school campus is very much about, I'll try something other than, is very much about these 5 conditions: community, Identity and culture becomes huge as we start to get back more and more into green schools. Physical education, we know that's important in terms of overall health and well-being, but there is a connection between that inside and outside. Health, wellness, and nutrition is becoming even trickier now as well, because we've got to really look at the connection of inside outside with health. When we start to look at nutrition, we've got to look at the garden. We've got to look at the kitchen. We have to look at the full cycle. When we start to talk about infrastructure improvements, then we're looking at stormwater. We're looking at recycling. We're looking at a zero carbon footprint, and then curriculum is how we're connecting the dots with these other 4 components, and hopefully being able to pull that one into that as well. So you've already been looking at LEED, at well building standards, sustainable sites, the SEED network evaluator. All of those do have aspects of the school specific that you have been hopefully taking a look at. Today we're going to focus on 3 other components, and I've provided a bunch of additional material in the Green Schools folder on the Google Drive. So feel free to take a look at that and use any of that. I think you'll find some of it. You do not need to get into a lot of detail. Part of it may be depending upon your particular level of interest in terms of what you would like to see us be involved with. So a couple things here. Green Ribbon School, we'll talk a little bit about that. Green Ribbon School is interesting in that it's become sort of the elitist accolade that a school can get. Interestingly enough, in Philadelphia, there's only one school that has Green Ribbon School status, and it happens to be the inner city school with the sort of highest percentage of high income parents, individuals. It takes a lot of work to get green ribbon status, but the thing that is great about it is it does and is holistic in its approach. So we've included it here for you guys to just think about and go through and look at the pillars that are that it starts to address. The system side of this, we start to move into that because schools do provide a systems approach, which is important. And one of the things that you see urban agriculture and farm to table only as it relates to, I think, gardens. But there's a whole nother piece to this, and that's cooking and composting and the selling of produce, the economics of it. And when we really start to talk about sustainable design, as you remember from last week, those are all key pieces. So a couple things that we want to sort of start with here is just to go back to the U.S. Green Building Council and the timeline, since a lot of this does get rolled into that larger organization. We didn't talk about this before. It has only been around and since 1993. And Rick, who is the founder of that, interestingly enough, not that much different than our well building standards. We have individuals who are looking at this, and this quote is from him: "The best environmental strategy is also the best business strategy." So you've got the U.S. Green Building Council, you have the Wellness Foundation, you have all these things that are being created and generated around the economics, which really is interesting. It was not a bunch of well-intentioned, go back. It was not driven by architects or environmentalists or anyone else. It was being driven by this standard. And this whole idea of a business strategy, which I think is good, but I think sometimes we tend to forget about that is where a lot of these things and it is a multi-million-dollar, billion-dollar business now. 1999, 8 national councils come together and they form the World Green Building Council, of which, of course, Rick is CEO. So he still has a major force in all of these things. It wasn't until 2011 when we saw the emergence of the Green Ribbon Schools program that came out of a coordinated effort, pretty much led by the U.S. Department of Education. And I put this quote in here because I think it summarized it well. That it is similar to the SITES program for landscape architects. It is a program that recognizes those schools that have hit this mark, that they've made great strides in what they've been doing. And so that's the tough part with this, because in order for a school to get green ribbon status, it's got to go through an application process. And from the schools that I have spoken with, most of them do not get it the first time around, or sometimes the second or the third. But anyway, it is holistic in its approach. It is about curriculum. It is about the buildings. It is about the school grounds. And it is about the overall operations in the building. And this is pretty important, because for the Department of Education to be saying, I'm going to really start to think about the overall building, and I'm going to start to think about the operations of it. That kind of a holistic approach is pretty amazing. It's saying that it's doing that based on this sort of the economics of it, that schools that function better will save money. So they are then, as this says here, awards will be given to schools that exemplify America's transition to a sustainable economy, from graduating environmentally literate students to effectively managing their carbon footprint. So it's a great idea. Makes a lot of sense. There are 3 pillars that come with the Green Ribbon program. First one is in reduced environmental impact and costs. Clearly, what that is, I don't go to that one yet. Now this is where you're really going to see a lot of similarities between what we've been looking at before with this is where we're going to really start to see a lot of similarities with our other national standards. Here we've got a larger philosophy around the reduction of greenhouse emissions, energy audits, just conservation measures, on-site renewable energy, and the purchase or use of green power and how we interpret that, water quality, reduced solids, and waste hazards. So these are some pretty hefty concepts that the fact that they're tying them into schools is pretty good. So I'll be interested to see what your philosophy is on, if you hit green ribbon, does that really in fact give you a certain LEED status? And if it does, then why aren't we talking about it that way? So I think it's interesting again, do we have these parallel tracks going on where you've got, LEED in one place, you've got green ribbon somewhere else, what is that, and why are we not seeing people connecting the dots on those? Okay, second pillar, improved health and wellness. So here we've got the 3 classic ones that everybody talks about, which is interesting because they have health, then they have nutrition, and then they have outdoor physical education, which is a little weird because health actually is all of those things. I think one way to think about this is that we have social and emotional health, we have nutrition health, and then we have physical activity as a health. But we're looking here at standards of coordinated school health and really covering all things which get into community, school environment, community environment. So it's pretty interesting that way. Effective environmental and sustainability education. Now, we're not going to dive in a lot in curriculum, but we've got to do some with it. So I don't worry about this one so much right now, because we have not gone through STEM education and what that is: science, technology, engineering, and math. I think we can get into some of those aspects of it, and then do a slightly deeper dive in it later. Schoolyards, and why schoolyards? One of the things that schoolyards are effective is if we start to think about this from a systems approach. And if we look at the number of times we Google green infrastructure, we get 1.3 million, 1,320,000 hits on that one. When we take a look at green schoolyards, that number goes down drastically to 6,630. When we take those two things together and we talk about green schoolyard infrastructure, the idea of how does schoolyards support our larger system, our infrastructure in our cities, we got a big no, nothing, zippo. And so that is one thing that we will start to talk about more, because they have incredible potential to help with that. On average, schoolyards are the second largest landowner in the U.S. And I apologize, this is repetitive for some of you, but it's important to go over it again. Its geographic distribution creates a patchwork of land parcels, which is really helpful when we start to think about an ecological model and how that works. This is a map of Philadelphia. Oops, go back. This is a map of Philadelphia. The gray dots and the red dots are schools, so it really can start to demonstrate for you the distribution of these throughout. So they really do have that opportunity to create greening spaces and augment efficient park systems, as well as really thinking about that larger idea of this infrastructure. So in that context, we'll talk a little bit about Philadelphia specific, because Philadelphia is leading the charge in its efforts around greening cities. It has a program called Green City, Clean Waters. So in 2011, the Water Department launched this program. It's a $2 billion 25-year plan to protect and enhance Philadelphia's watersheds. It's a very progressive program, and one of the things that it really does rely on is it relies heavily on green acres. So their plan is to actually come up with, at the end of this project, of greening 10,000 acres. This is Nebinger, an example of one schoolyard in the city, before and after, in terms of a rain garden. So taking asphalt areas within them and converting them into these stormwater rain gardens that also can create places for the school and the community become important. Other aspects that we'll start to think about more, getting into the detail, is other aspects of green stormwater infrastructure and this idea of miniature versions of green stormwater infrastructure elements. One of the things that I think you'll notice is there is not as much emphasis around helping students understand what a green roof is. Just having a green roof on a building is great, but if we had a green roof that's on top of a storage unit, if we have a green roof that's on top of a toolbox, if we have a green roof that's on top of a shade structure, that really allows for this sort of immediate connection for students to be able to see. This is an example in New York City at one of the sites where it actually has, it contains and collects all the stormwater off of the roof on this shade structure. It keeps it in this barrel, and then it has solar power to pump it up and use it during periods of drought to keep the green roof alive. And here is, your basic Berkeley hand pump approach, which is still okay to do. So a couple things to think about, and you'll have this in yours, is starting to make those connections in terms of our outcomes and benefits. That's a lot. Our outputs, our metrics, that is a lot of what we see in LEAD and what we see and how we're measuring. So we measure the success of these programs based on what they can accomplish. And it's really about this idea of benefits. So one thing that we've done with Philadelphia is looked at the idea of these silos of benefits that are educational, environmental, health-related, social, cultural, historical, and economic. Not much different than what we're seeing in everything else. So really, we just start to see variations on, I think, the same story in every one of those. How do we distill that down? How do we kind of pull that together so that we can articulate to people, yeah, this one move is satisfying green ribbon school status, and oh, by the way, it'll get you, silver status in well building standards, and you'll be able to hit your LEED performance standard for operations and maintenance. So this really becomes important as we start to think about how all of these things start to connect together for that sort of larger discussion. So right now we're gonna, I want to go to this video. I think it's a pretty good one for Greenfield. So we're going to do that. And again, remember that Greenfield Elementary is the only school in Philadelphia that has its green ribbon status.
When we started getting involved with this project, this schoolyard every day had 22 cars parked in it, driving in and out during the school day while the kids were out here on recess. And in addition to that, we had a huge dumpster with trash and sort of urban goo oozing out of it. So that was an unhealthy situation that there was just no reason for it. And at first, our base requirement was just getting the cars and the dumpster out of here. And then we were able to move on and say, okay, this is a schoolyard in a city. Many of these kids, they don't have the benefit of seeing season changes. And we have enough room here to actually put some green garden in here so they can start enjoying the wonder and magic of plants. And then at the same time, we were contacted by the school district to actually think very creatively about our schoolyard, and we all realized this was an opportunity to actually try and be a model for other schools in terms of making the schoolyard sustainable. So we started thinking about the greening aspects of the school and the stormwater drainage in particular.
My goal in terms of working with the school district is really working towards being green inside our building as well. Things like more efficient heating and cooling system, possibly a gray water reclamation system where we'd be pulling the drainage from our roof and pumping it back in to run our toilets. Using green products in the building for cleaning. So taking this green idea from the outside and going inside and start greening the inside of the building as well.
So I think that's just going to stop that for a moment, because that is how they were able to get that green ribbon status. And it really, although they did not achieve as many of the things that they wanted to with it, They are still working at this project and are hoping to continue to start to explore that interrelationship, because a lot of times what happens is the inability of the facility guys to think about what this means makes it very difficult to do that. So just keep that one in mind.
We worked with a very wonderful group here in the city called the Community Design Collaborative, who brought a volunteer group to work with us to start developing master planning concepts. We had parents involved and some teachers, and then community partners like the Horticulture Society, the Water Department, and other partners.
The Home and School Association here was really leading the effort. So they more or less invited us and said, we really have this great vision. We want to transform our school, starting with the schoolyard, and can we actually make this a stormwater management project? In the past at Greenfield, the idea for water management was really get the water off site as quickly as possible. So everything was paved and all the runoff was directed to inlets along the site and into a piping system. Those pipes were directly connected into the city's combined sewer system. All of that water went down to a treatment plant where it was cleaned up and released back into the river. In heavier rains, much of that water then kind of overwhelms the system and it overflows into the Schuylkill River. The new approach really thinks about rainfall as the resource, and it's part of the natural system. The idea is designing a landscape that can help absorb that rainfall. And that's how this schoolyard is transforming itself.
So this is probably now about a 3 or 4 year old rain garden system that all of the rubber, the blue and green rubber you see, is porous, soft surface material. And going right in, this is a school that is 100% open to the community. It is an extremely vital park space for the community after hours, and it is always open as that type of an amenity.
The first thing I said, well, has anybody considered taking up all this asphalt? Because to me, the asphalt was the prime problem with the schoolyard in terms of its imperviousness. And then it turned out my initial assumption wasn't the most effective solution. Leaving a portion of the asphalt here helps the efficiency because it actually directs the water to the rain garden areas. The whole schoolyard doesn't have to absorb the water. We just have to have it engineered so that the infiltration areas we have either under porous paving or under the rain garden areas has the capacity to absorb all the water that drains off of the asphalt.
In a schoolyard, you can't remove all the pavement. Kids are running back and forth. They're really active places. So we need hardscape, but that hardscape is draining into a rain garden. So that water will only make it into the sewer system in the heaviest rainfalls. So a project like this actually helps to reduce the number of those overflows into the Schuylkill River, which is only like 2 blocks away from here.
One thing to keep in mind, Philadelphia gets all of its drinking water from the Delaware and Schuylkill rivers. So this whole idea of upstream pollutants and then pollutants within the city become critical. Although Greenfield only took care of its stormwater on site, we do and will have possibilities of really exploring and understanding bigger moves and gestures on capturing roof water, whether that's a blue roof, whether that's a green roof, capturing on-street drainage, bringing that water in to help alleviate stress on the overall system as well.
There's no substitute to actually physically walking over to the river, seeing the river, and realizing that all the water that goes down that drain has a very short path to get right into that river.
Here's our little thermometer. You can see the different colors, so we can figure out what temperature it is.
It's a little kind of red and it's raining.
70% of the children here actually bused through the lottery system from all over Philadelphia. So those kids arrive in the morning on a bus, and then they go to school, and at the end of the day, they get on the bus and they go away. A lot of those kids are never exposed to the fact that a block away is the river. It's a multi-pronged approach we have, where we realize the integrated curriculum is just as important as the physical improvements, if not more so.
There's a difference in looking at asphalt versus looking at trees and plants that flower in the spring and give fruit in the late spring and early summer, and there's actually giving back something to you as a kid. You can go pick the blackberries, or you can go pick the pears from the pear tree, or those kind of things. It's just sort of a different interaction with an urban environment.
You want to guess what kind of mint this is? Smell it?
Like a peppermint?
Spearmint.
So one of the things that we will talk about a little bit more as we get into this is it's great that they've got a garden. It's an edible garden, but it doesn't complete the cycle. If you look around on the overall design, a comprehensive composting approach is not there. There are no tool sheds. There are no greenhouses. There are no places to be able to do salad prep and actually eat food outside. So that idea of sharing food or having student-driven or led farmers markets. So Greenfield's great. It's starting to get to that point, but a lot of these aspects of community life aren't there yet in this concept.
It brings an outdoor classroom for students and gives them an actual real-world connection to what they're learning in the classroom environment. There's different facets of this project that will change over the years in terms of how it interacts with the curriculum that they're learning. It sort of engages in a different way and cements it in the brain in a different way. You're in Center City here, and you've got a forest in a schoolyard. This is planted to look like and be exactly like a Pennsylvania woodland forest. So in 5-10 years, when you walk in here, you'll be kind of walking into a forest. So it's pretty cool. It's a pear tree.
If we don't expose the kids to the ideas of environmental stewardship and ecology and why we're doing this, we would not have been successful, because the life of the project has to go on through the students themselves.
Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. This is a really important date for us. We have a whole group of parents as well as a number of community partners.
One of the things that the Home and School Association felt very strongly about was to make the schoolyard part of the community's open space. Creating some more green space for this neighborhood in Center City that doesn't have a lot of green space immediately adjacent to it. It certainly is a challenge to start with a really big project. It is much easier to start small. It might just be one small garden or a tree planting project. One small project, it creates excitement and it creates interest, and that can build upon itself. Something to engage the surrounding community and get them thinking about what the future of that school can be.
So in case you guys didn't figure this out, this is a PR piece for the water department. All those green roofs that you just saw don't really exist yet. But I think it is a good, hopefully it's a good sort of primer for you guys in terms of what we're really talking about. Okay, so back again, kind of wrapping up with the rest of our slideshow. What we want to do is kind of move on, and one of the things that we did not really talk about here. Okay, so let's go back then and talk a little bit now on just a couple other aspects, things perhaps to think about along the lines of systems and what we've been talking about. One thing we have been exploring, and it would be interesting to see what you see in any of your documents around this concept, but we're looking at the idea of outdoor learning that maybe is amplified and goes one step. Oops, sorry. Goes one step beyond just having a garden outside, and really one of the things that we have been talking about, which we think makes sense in Philadelphia, is this idea of water. And is it not possible if we think about a more collective approach that takes rain gardens and vegetable gardens and brings those two things together? Because a lot of times, like for instance, in the discussion with Greenfield, they're talking about the rain garden and then they're talking about the edible garden, and they're not really bringing those two things together. But if we really start to think about the value of water and bringing those two things together, it starts to create an interesting scenario. The classroom then really starts to feed and address both spaces. We have been looking at both in-ground and raised garden beds, and then really looking at the idea of rain garden enhancements. As you start to take a look at some of the standards, and an additional piece that we will include in here is if we look at standards around green schools and creating green stormwater areas, this idea of how you enhance them. The Greenfield one was basically a very linear garden, and so students could come into it this way, and so that worked pretty well. But what happens if you've got a larger garden, and right now what's happening is there are no points of entry into that space, and so they're not being used. Having a path that might wander through to a gathering space where you could observe and monitor that then connects here allows these spaces to start to be used in a much more effective way. So that's something that we will start to talk about, both in terms of community engagement of these spaces and also in terms of students' use. And I included at the bottom here a quote that's from Partnership for 21st Century Schools. It says that physical spaces should be flexible and adaptable, enable collaboration, interaction, and information sharing, and should be connected with larger community that surrounds the school. So with a lot of this, the sustainability aspects of this is how do you take care of this stuff? And the water department doesn't have a plan for how to take care of rain gardens. And it's one of the biggest problems that we have with natural areas if you don't have a bunch of soccer moms who can take care of it. So if we start to take the idea of vegetable gardens, which have a clear understanding of stewardship, and pull that together with rain gardens, then this starts to make a lot of sense to people. So keep that in mind as you're looking through our standards. Are you seeing anything there, or are those deficiencies? So part of this is to say, wow, look, we've got all these great standards for some of this stuff, then we're missing this whole other piece. So again, this is just a little bit of a repeat. This piece, it really, again, starts to talk about another aspect of what we can do with our inside-outside approach. And so green STEM, again, science, technology, engineering, and math. You now hear people talk a lot about STEAM, which is science, technology, engineering, art, and math, which at some point, kind of like our standards, if you put enough acronyms in there, you just have education, and then it starts to get kind of silly, but we won't go there right now. But this is just, again, talking about monitoring. And is there a way that from an educational standpoint, we create the infrastructure that allows the students to understand soil moisture, a spectral analysis that shows how photosynthesis connects to plant health. Water and light needs for different plant species. When to plant, when to harvest. One of the things that becomes really interesting with some of these aspects is in our urban areas, we have students who have never grown anything, and yet we're telling them to put something in the ground and expect them to understand that. That's tough. Greenfield is interesting. If you remember during that video, they mentioned 70% of those students are bused in. That school has been so successful that that is no longer the case. A lot of the surrounding parents and more affluent community is now going to that school. I'm not sure what the number is. I'll double check and get back with you, but it is nowhere near that. So we need to start to really think about how we can do some of those things in our other schools. Green stormwater infrastructure. So the same thing. We're using the same monitoring system to be able to look at soil moisture, understanding flow patterns, looking at the level of infiltration that we might be getting. And then this last one, which I'm sorry you can't see, what is the precipitation data? So imagine if students actually start monitoring these things, and it's in their schoolyard is informing their education. It's also informing the water department and the city in terms of how well this system is doing. So a couple things just quickly that is interesting. There is the development of, the development of a open source software to be able to do this has been developed. In 2013, this was created at the geek show called the Hackathon in Philly, and GreenSTEM is something that's sort of come out of it, which is with the water department. But these guys developed a program that the students can then use. And what this program does is it has a, we have these root kits, which is what this is right here. The root kit here is being built by an 8th grader. So it's a pretty simple system. It only costs about $25 to make a root kit. Root kit sits in the ground. Radio signal goes up to Wi-Fi, which then with our open source programming allows for real-time data on the web for the students to be able to start to track and monitor these things. So one of the things that becomes interesting in terms of our built environment, and we'll talk about that a little bit, is this is a limitation. This ability for this radio signal to get to that transmitter from this garden limits where this can be. So we've done a couple things that we're working with the water department. The first one is to really think about an off-the-grid outdoor environment. That off-the-grid outdoor environment would then include some type of an armature for a solar panel that can really sort of control everything that we need out there. By bringing all of our transmittals and our transmitter out into the garden, we can increase our sensor range to 300 feet, which gives us huge flexibility within the garden to be able to do that. The solar panel then really starts to look at this idea of off-the-grid power, both for the monitoring system, but then we're looking at the ideas for communities to be able to have a place to get free Wi-Fi, plug in their phones, charge whatever they need. Gives us the opportunity to set up some infrared cameras outside to be able to track things. So this really starts to enhance this environment in a lot of ways. So does LEED really help us look at this idea of micro experiences? Maybe the building is not on solar power, but does this not really help a community and everyone else understand what our benefits are? So again, this whole idea of miniature versions of GSI elements and other types of green elements is a pretty interesting one. We've been exploring ideas on the armature. Does it rotate? Does it follow the sun? What are those things? This metal base, we need to be able to have, we need to have some kind of a better metal base or a protective space where we can house a lot of the equipment that we need out there to protect it from vandalism. So these kinds of architectural considerations are an interesting aspect of the Green School Year. Here is the students with their Arduino programming that free open space software. These are 8th graders. So again, this is just a reiteration. Really becomes interesting when you start to think of this idea of sustainability in terms of data analysis and collecting data and collecting information. And so some aspects of this is like watching paint dry. Obviously, soil temperature doesn't vary very much. So other things could be a bit more interesting than this. A couple more pictures just to show you how small this equipment is. This is how cheap this stuff is. These are some students that are designing little housing units for their root systems. And the most recent one that was done this year was creating a birdhouse, solar paneled birdhouse that would house our transmitter, but then also had this little infrared camera. This is our little infrared camera here, so that the students then could keep an eye on birds, while at the same time also being able to track our data in terms of moisture, soil, etc. Other aspects, the Boston Schoolyard Initiative is probably one of the most comprehensive ones. Oops, sorry about that. They have a whole series of guides that are online. We will get into those more. They have really looked at this exterior built environment and really looking at the idea of machines. 6 simple machines, or any simple machines that allow you to start to gauge things. So this is sort of the combination of both built environment, much more hands-on interactive, as well as technology. And really, I think we've got great opportunities to be able to explore both in terms of how that engages different community members as well as student grades. Oops, did it again. Okay, so we've talked a little bit then about stormwater. We've talked a little bit about the Green Ribbons program. We want to spend a little bit of time on food. I think it's one of the ones that is not as well developed in terms of its guides, and I'll be curious to see what you guys think. Interestingly enough, Denver Public School System has the most advanced sort of urban agriculture, culinary, recycle program in the country at a system level. There are probably some individual schools that are far exceed that, but for the moment we're going to use Denver for that. And so here, just like with stormwater, there is a systems concept that we want to try to really start to think about here in terms of how this works and how food systems connect with community, with infrastructure, health, wellness, and nutrition, physical activity, kind of a no-brainer, and then a curriculum. Slow Food USA is kind of leading this with their Garden to Cafeteria program. I know I've put a lot of information in there for you guys. There is a lot on the gardening movement. And oops, didn't want to do that quickly. But a lot with the gardening movement overall. But how it starts to relate to that cycle of not only of growing food, but eating food, harvesting food, selling food, and then recycling our waste is an important aspect of it. So this is a program that looks and helps students think about how to grow and harvest food safely, so that it can be used in their cafeteria or sold. And so that's really kind of an interesting piece to this. I've put some of the protocols in there, but they have gone through all of and had approved all of the food safety protocols. So when we start to think about our schools and this idea of this sort of community space, you know, we have garden, then we've got our building, and so really we have the cafeteria that's in there. And then we have the larger community that we're really trying to think about. So we have this opportunity for growing food and selling food. So, you know, the market and how that starts to connect. So if we really are trying to celebrate local foods, this is the perfect urban space to be able to do that. And that's another aspect of schools as this community engaged design component that's important. If you think back and looking at Greenfield, it looked pretty cool, but there wasn't a gathering space where you could have a long table to celebrate a food meal, or a place that really would facilitate farmers markets and those aspects of it. So anyway, this is a program. We've got information on there in there for you to be able to think about. A couple things that I would like you to consider when you think about then food and the aspect of it is clearly there is, you know, what can you grow, you know, per square foot. I think most of you have spent a lot of time. If you haven't taken Jody's class, you're all over that. But this is a more interesting one, and that's the kitchen. Because, you know, you can't do much with it if you don't figure out the kitchen, whether that's an inside kitchen or an outside kitchen, and what that might be like. The idea of a food hub is a little bit more along the lines of once this scales. So just like with the stormwater, we have a larger system. It is possible to get to a point where you've got an agricultural system where schools are growing enough food that we've got to create hubs in terms of where that food goes to. And here we talked a little bit about this earlier about food safety, but then we really get into some interesting things around zoning and infrastructure and what that means. And then we get into chickens, which is interesting. I don't see anyone talking about chickens or bees. That's a bad B. Obviously, I'm going to have to work on my writing skills with this thing. But there's another whole side to food and agriculture and what can work in cities. We have one school in Denver at Park Hill Elementary that has chicken coops. Only one. And nobody's got bees. So there's some really interesting ways that this thing starts to, I think, morph as we think about sustainability. And we definitely think about food. It's a huge untapped zone in terms of what the real potential is. So a couple things just to sort of keep in mind. And here, what I just wanted to kind of pick up on this is to not so much talk about Denver, but, is as you're looking at our guidelines and looking for these points of connection between them, this idea of community engagement, the fact that a garden actually helps reduce vandalism, I think becomes an interesting piece. We also know that vegetable gardens will help with overall maintenance and community engagement. So when we really start to look at that, I think that becomes an interesting one. This one's kind of obvious in terms of that integration of health wellness. Physical activity to garden is pretty amazing, and yet most people don't realize they're doing it. The abilities and possibilities around curriculum are huge. And because of the stewardship around it, huge numbers of volunteer hours. This is just a little interesting note back in 2008, and I don't have the statistics right now. This program does sell food to the cafeterias, and then it also sells food to the communities. So this becomes a really interesting aspect of what's going on. This one is really tricky to do if you don't have a salad bar at your school. But what was interesting with Denver, this program was part of the impetus to really get and explore how to get salad bars into schools, which is one of the easiest things to get without having to worry about other large kitchen assessment and kitchen infrastructure. So just some great shots in terms of school farmers markets that are completely kid run and managed. So the food aspect of this, creating cooking classes and really starting to get into that piece. We all love to eat food, and it is a huge piece of how we really start to bring that into our school garden programs. But more importantly, you need the facilities to be able to do that. And there's a lot of great ways to create outdoor cooking environments as well as indoor, or whether we do modified greenhouses or what those might look like. So just, in summary here, one of the things that I'm hoping you can also take a look at with your standards is what's missing. I think you're going to see a lot of overlap. These are some slides from a study that I was hired to do to look at the 16 master plans that were developed for schools in Philadelphia. And one of the things that I did with that is to say what's missing. And interestingly enough, and I don't know if you noticed in looking at Greenfield, there wasn't one there, is, this whole idea of multimodal. And we're really talking about how important that is. And yet, where is that? It might be in our sustainable sites with LEED. I don't know if we're going to see it in the green ribbon schools. I don't see if we're going to see it in any of our nature greening recommendations. I don't know if it's in our sites either. But it's critical. Only 3 out of the 16 school master plans had bike racks. And then, not only that, the place where they stuck the bike racks was kind of ridiculous. We have these new bike share programs. Every school ought to have, a bike share rack. The teachers have to get there. Just because a student might not be able to get one, certainly the teachers do and the parents do. So this whole idea of multimodal becomes really important. The idea of community connectivity between schools to each other. How do I cross in? What is important at these corners? That whole aspect of this becomes really important. Another one that is consistently missed is recycling, and I don't understand. Oops, sorry about that. I don't. So we have 2 dilemmas with recycling. The first one is that there is actually Philadelphia schools don't have a recycling program. The city picks up all the cardboard, and then everything else is had, but the school district has none. So they are going to be trying to get that. But aside from that, this is a picture from a school in New York City, and what they did is they have created their 2 different programs. One is for the students to be able to have a place where they can get access to easily to do their recycling. And then there's another one that's for the building. And that tends to be something that's much larger. So then the problem becomes, How do you get the stuff from the students one over to the building one? And then how does this whole thing relate to the site? And how does that work? So if we're really going to find a way to create recycling systems that are effective and are working, we need to be able to start to take a look at this. As we get into this, I visited one school in Bali this fall who actually took all of their composting and turned it into biofuel, which is great. I don't know how we'd ever get that past everybody here, but the schoolyard and the building has to start to really think about these points of connection in terms of these systems. And those systems are more than just lighting the building. And that's where I think the architects just aren't helping us out at all with that. Oops, oh my God, come back. Sorry about that. Let's get back to our slideshow. We're almost at the end anyway. So the last thing I'm going to leave, and then I just want to do a little recap on some aspects of what we're looking at, what we're talking about. And that's this idea of levels of engagement. This is a document that's in your Google Drive. The Children Nature Network just got a big fat grant from the Kellogg Foundation to create this whole idea of building a national movement for green schoolyards in every community. The Children Nature Network was something that was started by a gentleman called Richard Louv. Oops, it's not going to let me. Oh, shut up. Rich Louv wrote a book called Last Child in the Woods, and it has been amazing in terms of what it's triggered nationally. And he is the one who also then coined this nature deficit syndrome, that children are losing their connection, which is great. It's important. Out of that work, he created the Children Nature Network that is very much around that. They have started to realize that perhaps the green schoolyard is more than just greening. It's about physical activity. It's about other things. This document, be curious to see what you guys think of it, is designed, I think it is a popular piece that is really designed, I think, to engage just the general community, parents, whoever it might be. And so I think that's where we start to see difficulties with all these different documents that we've got. Because, you know, we've got these different levels. We have designers. We have students. We have teachers and school districts. We have other agencies. And so I think one of the things that I'm starting to see is that this morass of information is dealing with these things. I'm not sure who would use sites except a landscape architect. Maybe I'm wrong. There's this huge organization called Green Schools, which is the big organization for the U.S. Green Building Association, and it is very driven towards students and engaging students, which is important. But you know, what do we do when we've got all of these different levels of information out there? And then you have what I would say silo-specific groups. And these silo-specific groups only care about one thing. So Slow food only cares about food. They don't care about children and nature, not at least as their first priority. The Nature Network has nature as its first priority, but not physical activity or social emotional well-being. And most of these are not very sensitive to urban environments. I mean, just look at the picture. Yeah, these kids are out in these green spaces, and they certainly look like a bunch of suburban children. I think this will be one of the things as you're pulling your information together, and some of the things that we can start to talk about is, different documents engaging different individuals. So what does that say in terms of you as a designer, as someone engaging a community and trying to bring people forward? What does all this documentation mean? Because there's a lot of it out there. Okay, so then in summary, two things. Keep in mind that the assignment due Friday is only 10 points. It's really to start the discussion and the dialogue. It's a beginning point. It's something that you will continue to add to. It's a living document. So let's not hyperventilate over it. I will send out an invite for a Zoom meeting on Tuesday. We will have a chance to meet and chat with each other, talk a little bit about where we are, have a question and answer, etc. Please feel free to contact me. If you go into my profile, which you should be able to, my phone number's in there. You can tweet me, you can text me. Morgan was having a hard time for some reason. Her CU account wouldn't let her access the Google Drive. She's there. So you can bug me, and I will try to respond as quickly as possible. And with that, I'm going to sign off. Thanks, everybody, and talk to you on Tuesday.